Feudalism was born between the 9th and 10th centuries, amid the chaos left by the fall of the Roman Empire of Occidente. Calm the collapse of central power, barbarian invasions, and the disappearance of cities, Europe plunged into a period of insecurity and political fragmentation. With no national armies and no organized public administration, survival depended on the personal relationship of protection and loyalty. Powerful lords, former military chiefs, nobles, or landlords, began to offer shelter and security in exchange for services and loyalty. From this relationship, based on mutual obligations, the feudal system was born. It was an essentially rural, agrarian, and hierarchical society in which land was the center of all power relations. Those who owned land had authority. Those who did not have it owed submission. The feudal pyramid, the world divided into layers. The feudal system could be viewed as a pyramid of power and dependence. Each level of society owed obligations to the superior and exercised dominion over the inferior. The hierarchy was both social and spiritual, as it was believed that God had determined one's place. In a simplified way, this pyramid was composed of three orders. 1. Those who pray, the clergy, the church. 2. Those who war, the nobility, lords and knights. 3. Those who work, the peasants and serfs. However, within each order, there were complex sublayers of power, as we will see below. The top of the pyramid, the king and the high nobility. The feudal king, although often represented as absolute sovereign, the king in the Middle Ages had limited power. He was the Lord of Lords, but he depended on the loyalty of the great nobles, the suzerains, who controlled vast territories. The king granted fiefs, large portions of land, to trusted nobles in exchange for loyalty and military support. This relationship was formalized by an oath of vassalage, carried out in a solemn ceremony where the vassal knelt before the king, placing his hands between his and promising loyalty. However, in practice, real power was fragmented. Each feudal lord administered his lands like a small monarch, with his own army, local laws, and his own justice system. For much of the Middle Ages, kings were more symbolic figures than effective rulers. Only from the end of the feudal period, 13th-15th centuries, did they begin to strengthen their kingdoms, giving rise to national monarchies. The feudal lords. The local government. Below the king were the great feudal lords, dukes, earls, marquises, and barons, who exercised authority over vast tracts of land. They were the real rulers of everyday life. Each lord owned a fief, divided into three main parts. The manorial reserve, land for the exclusive use of the lord, cultivated by the serfs. The manso servile, parcels given to the peasants, who owed part of their production to the lord, communal lands, forests, pastures, and rivers for collective use, but controlled by the lord. The feudal lord exercised political, military, economic, and judicial power. He collected taxes, administered local justice, and maintained an army of his own. His word was law within the fief, and his authority was seen as a reflection of divine order. The loyalty of vassals was guaranteed by bonds of personal dependence, sustained by honor, oaths, and rewards. This network of obligations, suzerainty, and vassalage formed the backbone of feudal society. The knights, the nobility of the sword. Below the great lords were the knights, nobles of lesser power, but fundamental in the military structure of feudalism. They were the direct vassals of more powerful lords, receiving small fiefs or rents in exchange for armed protection. The knight's life was governed by the code of chivalry, which combined Christian and military values: courage, loyalty, faith, honor, and defense of the weak. Knights were trained from childhood for war and to serve the nobility and the church. In times of peace, they participated in tournaments and hunts. In times of war, they protected the fiefs and accompanied the lord on campaigns militares. Calm time, many knights became military religious orders, such as the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonics, uniting sword and cross in defense of the faith. The clergy. Spiritual and intellectual power. Parallel to the nobility, there was an equally powerful hierarchy, the Catholic Church. During feudalism, the church was both a religious institution and a political and economic power. The Pope and the high hierarchy. At the top was the Pope, considered God's representative on earth. Below him, archbishops and bishops controlled dioceses, accumulating wealth and influence. Many bishops were also feudal lords, with land, serfs, and armies. The regular clergy and the secular clergy. The regular clergy lived in monasteries, following monastic rules of prayer and work. They were responsible for the preservation of knowledge, copying manuscripts, and teaching in monastic schools. The secular clergy, made up of priests and parish priests, worked directly with the people. They administered the sacraments, collected tithes, and controlled the spiritual life of the communities. The church had power over all social strata, as it had a monopoly on knowledge and salvation. It was she who legitimized kings, blessed wars, and defined what was sin or virtue. For this reason, many historians claim that in the feudal world, the cross and the sword ruled together. The peasants and serfs, the base of the pyramid. At the base of the feudal pyramid were the peasants, who were responsible for all agricultural production. Without them, the system simply wouldn't exist. Most were not slaves, but servants, tied to the land without full freedom. The serf owed the lord corvées, days of free work, jars, part of the harvest, and various tributes, such as fees for using the mill, the oven, or the bridge of the fief. Although they owned small plots to cultivate and support their families, serfs could not leave the fief without permission. Their bond was hereditary. Children of serfs would also be serfs. They lived in simple rural villages, with houses of wood and straw, subjected to the rhythm of the seasons and the demands of the lord. Their lives were short and marked by hunger, disease, and superstition, but faith gave them hope of reward after death. Freemen, bourgeois, and artisans. Although the feudal world was dominated by lords and serfs, there was a small but important layer of free men. They were independent peasants, artisans, and merchants who lived in small villages or, later, in the growing cities. With the role of women in the feudal system, women were also part of this hierarchy, although subject to male authority. In noble families, they managed the castle in the absence of their husbands, taking care of finances, servants, and the education of their children. Some, such as Eleanor of Aquitaine, came to exert great political influence. In the lower strata, peasant women worked in the fields, took care of animals and household chores. They had few opportunities and lived under strict norms of Christian morality. In the women's monasteries, however, some found refuge and instruction, becoming abbesses and even intellectuals, such as Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century philosopher, physician, and composer. The junction between religion and power. The church legitimized the social structure by claiming that inequality was part of the divine order. According to medieval theology, the world was composed of three orders created by God: those who prayed, clergy; those who fought, nobility; and those who worked, peasants. Each group should fulfill its function with obedience and resignation. Thus, faith became the ideological cement of the system. Sermons, religious festivals, and daily rites reinforced the idea that poverty was virtuous and obedience guaranteed salvation. In this way, the church was the moral and cultural pillar of feudal power. The weakening of the layers of power. From the 14th century, feudalism began to decline. Several factors contributed to this: the growth of commerce and cities, the emergence of money, the agricultural crises and the Black Death, the strengthening of monarchies, and wars such as the 100 Years. The emerging bourgeoisie began to challenge the old order. The kings began to centralize power, weakening the feudal lords and reorganizing the state. The church, shaken by schisms and criticism, lost part of its spiritual authority. The rigid layer system gave way to a more dynamic and monetary society, the prelude to the modern age. The pyramid that shaped the West. For almost 1,000 years, feudalism structured Europe as a gigantic social pyramid, supported by the earth, faith, and the sword. Each layer fulfilled an essential function, and together they ensured the survival of a fragmented continent. Even after the end of the system, its marks remained. The social hierarchy, the power of the church, the prestige of the nobility, and the ideal of obedience continued to influence European thought for centuries. To understand the layers of power in the feudal system is to understand the roots of Western civilization, from its political institutions to its worldview. A reminder that even when the pyramid collapses, its stones continue to shape the ground on which we walk. If you enjoyed this dive into medieval history, subscribe, activate the bell, and share this video. In the next episode, we will explore how trade and cities began to challenge feudal power, giving rise to the modern age.